My Aunt Alina hadn't spoken to me in 20 years. Not at my wedding, which she didn't attend. Not at my father's funeral, where she sat 3 rows back and left before the reception. Not once in 2 decades did her name appear on a birthday card or a Christmas envelope. So when the lawyer cleared his throat in that overly air-conditioned office and said my name, Alina Margaret Whitfield leaves the entirety of Briar Hollow to her grandniece, I thought he had misread the document. My cousin Davenport thought so too. He stood up so fast his chair scraped backward across the hardwood floor, and for a moment, before the lawyer continued reading, I watched 2 decades of his quiet confidence crack down the middle. Then the lawyer kept reading. There was a catch. There is always a catch with my family. 30 days, 30 dinners, and every single person who had once helped push me out of that family's good graces would be required, by the terms of the will, to sit across from me at that same long oak table. Every night, or the entire estate would be liquidated and given to a wildlife trust in my aunt's name. I almost laughed. Almost. Because what none of them understood yet, what I myself wouldn't understand until the 17th night, was that my aunt hadn't written this clause to bring us back together. She'd written it so I could finally watch them, up close, with nowhere to hide. I should tell you who Alina Whitfield was before I tell you what she left behind, because the house meant nothing without her in it. And for most of my childhood, she was the only adult in my family who looked at me like I was a whole person instead of a problem to be managed. She was my late father's aunt, which made her my great-aunt, though nobody in the family ever used that word. She was simply Aunt Alina, sharp-eyed and silver-haired even when I was small enough to ride on her hip, with a laugh that came out sideways, like she was always slightly amused by something the rest of us hadn't caught up to yet. She lived at Briar Hollow, a rambling stone farmhouse an hour outside of town, with a wraparound porch and a garden so overgrown with foxglove and climbing roses that the local kids used to dare each other to walk through it at dusk. I was the daughter of her favorite nephew, which should have made me beloved by extension. Instead, it made me a target, because my father married my mother, a hairdresser from 2 towns over, with no family money and no patience for the Whitfield habit of speaking in implications instead of sentences, and the rest of the family never quite forgave him for it. When my father died of a heart attack at 44, I was 12 years old, and within a year, my mother and I had been quietly, politely, thoroughly excised from every family gathering that mattered. Every gathering, that is, except the ones at Briar Hollow. Aunt Alina never stopped inviting us. She'd call my mother directly, skip the rest of the family's gossip chain entirely, and say, in that dry voice of hers, "I'm making a roast Sunday. Bring the girl." She was the only person who called me the girl with something like affection rather than dismissal. I spent my teenage summers at that house, weeding her garden beds while she told me stories about my father as a boy. How he used to climb the old oak by the pond. How he'd once tried to convince the entire family that he'd seen a ghost in the cellar just to get out of chores. She taught me to can tomatoes, to read a property deed, to recognize when someone was lying to me by the way their eyes drifted up and to the left before they answered a question they hadn't expected. "Your cousin Davenport does that," she told me once, when I was maybe 16, watching him needle me about my mother's job at a family barbecue I hadn't technically been invited to but had come to anyway, at Alina's insistence. "Watch his eyes next time he tells you something convenient." I didn't understand then why she was teaching me to read people instead of teaching me to trust them. I understand now. She knew, long before I did, exactly what kind of family I'd been born into, and she was preparing me for it the way some people prepare a child for a storm they can see coming on the horizon, long before the sky actually changes color. When I was 22, my mother got sick, and what little money we had went toward hospital bills the insurance wouldn't cover. Davenport's mother, my Aunt Patricia, Alina's actual daughter and the undisputed matriarch of what remained of the family's social standing, made it known, through the same gossip chain that had once excised my father, that my mother's illness was exactly the kind of thing that happens when people don't plan properly. It got back to me within a week. It always did. I stopped going to Briar Hollow after that. Not because Alina had done anything. She hadn't. She never did. She remained the one constant kindness in an otherwise cold family. but because I couldn't separate the house from the people who orbited it, and I didn't have the strength left to keep doing that math every time I walked through her front door. I called her, though, every few months for years. She always picked up on the second ring like she'd been waiting. "You should come by," she'd say. "I will," I'd say and mean it and not come. The last time I spoke to her was 4 months before she died. She asked me, almost offhand, what I remembered about the cellar at Briar Hollow. I laughed and told her I remembered Dad's ghost story. She didn't laugh back. "Good," she said. "Hold on to that." I thought it was just an old woman's strange tangent. I didn't think about it again until the 17th night. The law office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown that I'd never had reason to enter, all dark wood paneling, and the particular silence of a room where people go to find out how much they're worth to someone who's already dead. I arrived 11 minutes early and found I was the last one there. Aunt Patricia sat at the head of the small gathering, in a black dress that looked tailored rather than mournful, flanked by her son Davenport, 41 now, still wearing the same expression of preemptive entitlement he'd had at family barbecues 20 years earlier, and her daughter Marguerite, who I hadn't seen since my father's funeral, and who gave me a smile so brief I almost missed it. There were a handful of cousins I barely recognized, 2nd and 3rd tier Whitfields who'd shown up for an inheritance they assumed was theirs by proximity alone. Nobody saved me a seat. I took the one closest to the door, which felt, even then, like an old habit reasserting itself, always positioned for an exit. The lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Aldous Crane, who'd apparently handled Aliner's affairs for over 30 years, opened a leather folder with the unhurried calm of someone who had done this exact thing 1,000 times, and had learned, long ago, never to react to what a room did when its expectations were overturned. He went through the smaller bequests first, a modest sum to Marguerite, a set of antique clocks to a cousin named Harold, a donation to the County Historical Society. Patricia received the contents of Aliner's jewelry box, and notably, nothing else. I watched her face stay perfectly composed through that part, the way a person's face stays composed when they've already decided the real prize is coming, and the small stuff doesn't matter. Then Mr. Crane turned a page, and his voice changed register slightly. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. "The remainder of the estate," he read, "including the property known as Briar Hollow, all structures, acreage, and contents therein, along with the associated trust accounts, is bequeathed in full to my grandniece." He said my name. The silence that followed had a texture to it. I felt it land on my skin before I fully processed the words, the way you feel a change in weather before you see the clouds. Davenport's chair scraped back. Patricia's composed face finally cracked, just at the corner of her mouth, just for a second, before she smoothed it back into something diplomatic. "There must be a mistake," Patricia said. Her voice was even. Patricia's voice was always even. It was one of the more frightening things about her. "There's no mistake," Mr. Crane said, "though I should note there is a condition attached." He turned another page. "The beneficiary must reside at Briar Hollow for a period of 30 consecutive days from the date of this reading. During that period, she is required to host an evening meal each night, attended by the immediate family members named in this will, specifically Patricia Whitfield Ashford, Davenport Ashford, and Marguerite Ashford Lee. Should any single family member fail to attend 3 or more dinners, without documented medical cause, or should the 30-day residency be broken for more than 48 consecutive hours, the entire estate reverts to the Aliner Whitfield Wildlife Conservation Trust, and no family member shall have further claim." I sat very still. I had the distinct sense of being inside a story my aunt had written specifically for this room, this exact arrangement of people, and I hadn't yet been told what kind of story it was. "That's absurd," Davenport said. "She can't possibly think we're going to, perform reconciliation dinner theater for a month, because some old woman's lawyer wrote it into a will." "I'm only reading the terms as instructed," Mr. Crane said, with the patience of a man who got paid handsomely not to have opinions about his client's final wishes. Patricia recovered her composure faster than her son did. She turned to me, actually looked at me, for what might have been the first time in 15 years, and I watched her run a calculation behind her eyes. "Well," she said, 30 dinners, that's not so terrible, is it? We're family after all." She said it the way you'd say something you didn't believe but needed everyone else to believe you believed. And I understood, watching her say it, that she had already decided to play along, not because she wanted reconciliation, but because she wanted the house, and 30 dinners was a small price to pay for a property worth, by Mr. Crane's later estimate, somewhere north of $4 million. I should have been thinking about the house. I should have been thinking about the money, the legal weight of it, the fact that my mother had died 8 years earlier without enough savings to cover her own funeral, and now I was being handed an estate that could have changed both our lives if it had come 10 years sooner. Instead, I kept thinking about the seller, about Aliner's voice on that last phone call, asking what I remembered, telling me to hold on to it. Good, hold on to that. She had known, even then, that she was dying. She had known she was about to set something in motion that would force these 3 people back into a room with me for 30 straight nights. And some old instinct, sharpened by all those summers of garden weeding and quiet lessons about reading people's eyes, told me that the dinners themselves were never the point. They were the stage. I just didn't yet know what play she'd written. Briar Hollow looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do, and also somehow more itself. The porch a little more weathered, the climbing roses gone slightly feral over the trellis, the same crooked mailbox at the end of the long gravel drive. I parked my car beside Aliner's old truck, which apparently came with the estate and which I had no idea how to feel about driving, and I stood there for a long moment before I went inside, because I understood, standing on that gravel, that I was about to live for 30 days inside a house that held every good memory of my childhood, and was about to be filled, every evening, with the people responsible for most of the bad ones. Mr. Crane had given me a single sealed envelope along with the keys, with instructions that I was to open it only once I'd moved in. Aliner's handwriting on the front, for the girl, when she's home, undid something in my chest that I'd kept carefully tied off for years. I didn't open it the first night. I told myself I wasn't ready, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid that whatever was inside would make the next 30 days harder, not easier, and I needed one night of just being in the house, alone, before I let her voice back into my head. I walked through the rooms instead. The parlor, still smelling faintly of the cedar polish she used on the furniture. The kitchen, where a recipe box sat exactly where it always had, her handwriting on yellowed index cards for dishes I remembered eating as a girl. The library, where she'd kept her property records and her genealogy books, and I noticed, running my hand along the spines, a small gap on one shelf where something had clearly been removed. I didn't think much of the gap that first night. I would think about it a great deal more by the second week. Upstairs, the guest room she'd always given me as a teenager was made up fresh. The quilt on the bed one I recognized from summers spent reading by the window while she worked in the garden below. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph I hadn't seen before me, maybe 15, dirt-streaked and laughing, holding up a tomato like a trophy, Aliner's hand just visible at the edge of the frame, resting on my shoulder. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time before I cried. The first dinner was the following evening, and I spent most of the day preparing for it the way you prepare for a job interview you don't want, but can't afford to fail, cleaning, cooking a roast from Aliner's recipe card, setting the long oak dining table with the good china I found in the break front, because some old performative instinct told me that if I was going to do this, I would do it the way Aliner would have. Calm, composed, giving them nothing to use against me. Patricia arrived first, exactly on time, in pearls that looked like they'd been chosen specifically to communicate I am not impressed by any of this, but I am too well-bred to say so. Davenport arrived 12 minutes late, which I would come to learn was a pattern, a small, repeated assertion that his time mattered more than mine. Marguerite arrived last, slipping in quietly, apologizing for nothing, taking the seat farthest from her mother without seeming to think about it. We ate roast chicken in near silence for the first 20 minutes. Patricia complimented the china. Davenport asked, with the studied casualness of a man pretending not to care what my plans were for the property once all this was settled. "I haven't decided," I said, which was true. "You should sell," he said. "Realistically, a place like this is a money pit. Foundation work alone." "I haven't decided," I said again, and he let it drop. But I watched his jaw tighten, and I filed that away the way Alina had taught me to file things away, not reacting, just watching, just nodding which thread to pull on later. It was Marguerite who said the thing that stuck with me longest that first night. Near the end of the meal, when Patricia and Davenport had drifted into a conversation about a cousin's upcoming wedding, Marguerite leaned slightly toward me and said, quiet enough that the others didn't catch it, "She talked about you, you know, Grandma Alina, more than you'd think." "What did she say?" Marguerite's eyes flicked toward her mother before she answered, a small, habitual caution that I recognized instantly, because I'd spent years doing the same thing around people whose disapproval could rearrange your whole life. "She said you were the only one of us who ever actually looked at things, instead of around them." I didn't know what to do with that sentence yet. I wouldn't, not really, until the dinners had peeled back enough layers of this family that I could see what Alina had apparently seen for years, what she'd been quietly documenting, perhaps, in whatever book was missing from that gap on her library shelf. That night, after they left, I finally opened the envelope. Her handwriting was steadier than I expected for someone who had, by then, been quite ill. "My dear girl, if you're reading this, you've moved back into the house, which means you've already done the hardest part, walked through that door knowing what waits at the dinner table for the next 30 nights. I'm sorry for that. I am. But I need you to trust an old woman's reasoning a little longer, because I didn't write this clause to torture you, and I certainly didn't write it hoping the three of them would suddenly discover their better natures over a series of pot roasts. I wrote it because I am the only person left alive who knows the whole shape of what happened to you and your mother, and I have spent the last several years too cowardly to say it to anyone's face. So instead, I am going to make them say it to yours. Slowly. One dinner at a time, whether they mean to or not, because people who believe they're performing reconciliation tend to relax their guard in ways they never would if they knew they were actually on trial. You asked me once on the phone what you remembered about the cellar. I want you to go down there. Not tonight, you've had enough for one day, but soon. Bring a flashlight and look behind the shelving on the east wall, the one your father used to hide behind when he played his ghost game. There's a loose stone. I won't tell you what's behind it. You were always better at finding things than being told about them. One more thing, and then I'll let you sleep. Watch Davenport's eyes when anyone mentions the year you turned 20. Watch Patricia's hands when anyone mentions your mother. And listen, actually listen, to what Marguerite doesn't say, because that girl has been carrying something for 15 years and she is, I think, finally ready to put it down, if someone gives her the chance. I am so very proud of who you became, despite all of us. Hold on to that, too. I read it 3 times before I set it down. Then I sat in the dark of that guest room, the photograph of 15-year-old me and her tomato trophy watching from the nightstand, and I understood with a kind of cold clarity that Alina Whitfield had not left me a house. She had left me an investigation, with 30 nights to solve it, and a family who had no idea they'd already been called as witnesses. I didn't go down to the cellar that night, but I lay awake a long time, thinking about loose stones and lying eyes, and a quiet sister-in-law I'd written off years ago who might, after everything, have something worth hearing. The next 29 dinners were waiting. I had no idea yet how much they would cost everyone at that table, including me. I went down to the cellar on the 3rd day, in the gap between breakfast and the grocery run I needed to make before that night's dinner, telling myself I was only being thorough, that Alina's letter was probably just an old woman's sentimental nudge toward a box of childhood keepsakes. I didn't fully believe that. I brought the flashlight anyway. The cellar smelled the way it always had: damp stone and old cedar, a faint mineral coolness that never changed regardless of season. The shelving on the east wall was exactly where I remembered it, sagging slightly under decades of canning jars and paint cans, and the kind of household debris that accumulates in a house lived in by one person for 40 years. I moved the shelving unit aside, my arms straining against its weight, and ran my hand along the stones until I found the one Aliner meant, slightly recessed, its mortar lighter than the stones around it, like it had been reset more recently than the rest of the wall. It came loose with surprisingly little effort, as though it had been removed and replaced many times. Behind it was a metal lockbox, small enough to fit in a grocery bag, and beside it, wrapped in a plastic sleeve to keep out the damp, a leather-bound ledger that I recognized immediately as the missing book from the library shelf. I didn't open either of them down there. I carried them up into the kitchen light, set them on the same table where I'd be serving dinner in a few hours, and sat with my hands flat on the lockbox lid for a long moment before I worked up the nerve to open it. Inside were documents, property records, bank statements going back nearly 15 years, and a folder of photocopied letters between Patricia and a man named Russell Voss, whom I didn't recognize, dated to the spring I turned 20. I set those aside for later, because the ledger was calling to me more urgently, Aliner's handwriting filling page after page in the same steady hand from the letter upstairs. It was a diary, not of her days, but of her family, observations, dates, small cruelties she'd witnessed and apparently decided to record rather than confront, the way some people keep evidence instead of keeping the peace. An entry from the year my mother first got sick. Patricia told Marguerite at the church social that some families simply don't plan ahead. I said nothing. I am ashamed of saying nothing. An entry from a year later. Davenport asked me outright when I planned to update my will. He has asked me this 4 times now. I am beginning to understand what kind of man my grandson has become. And then, near the middle of the book, an entry that made the kitchen feel suddenly very quiet around me. I found out today what really happened the year the girl turned 20. I am sick about it. I do not yet know what to do with what I know, only that I cannot undo it, and I am too old and too tired to fight Patricia in the open. But I will not let it die with me unrecorded. Someone should know the truth eventually, even if I am not brave enough to be the one who tells her. The entry ended there. No explanation of what had happened, no name attached beyond the pronouns. I read it 4 times, then 5, my dinner prep forgotten, the roast still sitting unseasoned on the counter, until I made myself close the ledger and put both it and the lockbox in the bottom drawer of Aliner's old writing desk, because I could hear Davenport's car on the gravel drive, and I needed, for one more evening, to look like a woman who didn't yet know there was something to look for. I watched him that night the way Aliner had taught me to, all those summers ago at the garden table, not starring, never starring, just keeping his face in the soft edge of my attention while I appeared to be focused on something else entirely. Patricia brought up, unprompted, a story about my 20th birthday, something about how she remembered a lovely little gathering, her tone bright and uncomplicated, as though she were genuinely reminiscing. I hadn't had a gathering that year. I'd had a fight with my mother about hospital bills and a long, lonely night at a diner with a slice of pie I couldn't really afford. I let the comment pass without correcting it and watched Davenport instead. His eyes went up and to the left before he said, too quickly, "I barely remember that year, honestly," and reached for his water glass in a motion that looked deliberately casual, the kind of movement people make when they need their hands to do something other than betray them. It wasn't proof of anything. A flicker of the eyes isn't a confession, but it confirmed something Aliner's diary had already planted in me, that the year I turned 20 was not, in fact, an unremarkable year that simply happened to be the year my mother's illness drained what little security we had left. Something else had happened, something Davenport remembered with enough discomfort to lie badly about forgetting. I didn't push. Aliner's letter had told me to watch, not to confront, and some instinct told me the dinners were a slow excavation, not a single dramatic dig. Marguerite, for her part, said almost nothing that whole meal, which I'd come to understand was its own kind of language with her. She picked at her food. She watched her mother and brother with an expression I couldn't quite place until later, something between exhaustion and rehearsal, like a woman watching a play she'd seen too many times and could no longer pretend to enjoy. After they left that night, I found the folder of letters between Patricia and the man named Russell Voss, and I finally read them properly. The letters spanned about 8 months, the spring and summer of the year I turned 20, and they were business correspondence at first glance, formal, dry, discussing what appeared to be a property assessment. It took me 3 readings to understand what they were actually discussing. Russell Voss, it turned out, had been a private investment advisor Patricia hired that year, and the letters detailed an arrangement. A small parcel of land adjoining Briar Hollow, land that had technically belonged to my father, and after his death, was meant to pass to me upon my majority. The letters discussed a voluntary transfer, a family arrangement, language so carefully sanitized that it took me a long time, sitting at that kitchen table with Aliner's old reading lamp throwing yellow light across the pages, to understand what I was actually looking at. Patricia had arranged for that parcel of land, my inheritance from my father, 10 acres along the creek that Aliner's diary referred to elsewhere as the girl's birthright, to be quietly sold off before I ever turned 21 and could claim it myself. The paperwork had been handled through a guardianship technicality, exploiting the fact that my mother, exhausted and overwhelmed by medical bills and grief, had signed documents she likely never fully understood, documents Patricia's lawyer had drafted, and Patricia herself had personally walked over to our apartment for signature, the spring my mother's illness was at its worst. There was a final letter in the folder, the most damning of all, from Voss to Patricia. As discussed, the transfer proceeds have been deposited per your instructions. I trust this resolves matters satisfactorily for all parties involved, though I'll note for the file that the niece's mother did not appear to fully grasp the nature of what she was signing. I assume that's not a concern for you. I sat with that letter for a long time, long enough that the kitchen went fully dark around me and I didn't bother turning on more lights because some part of me needed the dimness, needed not to be entirely seen. While I let 20 years of quiet exclusion finally make sense. Patricia hadn't just disapproved of my mother. She had taken something from me materially, deliberately, while my mother was too sick and too trusting to understand what she was signing. And then she had spent 2 decades treating my family's poverty as a moral failing rather than the consequence of her own theft. I understood, finally, why Aliner had been too ashamed to say it to anyone's face. And I understood why she'd built 30 dinners instead of 1 confrontation, because a single accusation could be denied, deflected, lawyered away. But 30 nights of watching these people relax into the comfortable belief that I knew nothing, that was a different kind of evidence. That was time enough to find everything else. The dinners that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. I cooked. They came. We performed a version of family that none of us quite believed in, and underneath it, I kept digging, through the ledger, through old county property records I requested online, through a handful of careful, casual questions dropped into dinner conversation that none of them seemed to register as anything but small talk. I learned, slowly, that Davenport's discomfort around my 20th year wasn't separate from Patricia's land scheme. He'd known about it. Not orchestrated it, but known, and said nothing, because the proceeds from that quiet land sale had, according to the ledger, partially funded the down payment on his first house. He had benefited directly from what was taken from me, and he had carried that knowledge in silence for 2 decades the same way he'd once needled me about my mother's job, with the easy cruelty of someone who'd never had to reckon with consequences. Marguerite was different. On the 12th dinner, after Patricia and Davenport had left early for some social obligation, she lingered at the door longer than usual and finally said in a voice that shook slightly, "I need to tell you something. Not tonight. I'm not ready tonight, but soon." "Whenever you're ready," I said, and meant it, because Aliner's letter had told me to listen to what Marguerite didn't say, and I was beginning to understand that her silence wasn't complicity, it was fear. The particular fear of a daughter who'd watched her mother dismantle someone else's life and had never found the courage to say so out loud. She came back on the 17th night, after dinner, after Patricia and Davenport had gone, and she sat back down at the table across from me with the particular stillness of someone about to set down a weight she'd been carrying a long time. "I was 16, she said, the spring it happened. I heard my mother on the phone with that Voss man. I didn't understand all of it then, but I understood enough that she was selling something that wasn't hers to sell, that it had something to do with your father's land, that she didn't want anyone, especially your mother, to fully understand what she was signing. Marguerite's hands were wrapped tightly around her water glass. I never told anyone. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was just a kid, that there was nothing I could do about it anyway. And then years went by, and it got easier to just not think about it, and harder every year to imagine saying something, because what would that even accomplish at this point, except blowing up what was left of the family? Why are you telling me now? Because Grandma Aliner came to me near the end, Marguerite said. She knew I'd overheard something. She'd known for years, I think, the way she seemed to know everything eventually. She didn't ask me to confess to you. She just asked me one question, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. Marguerite looked up. She asked me what kind of woman I wanted to become. The kind who keeps quiet to keep the peace, or the kind who's actually peaceful, because she doesn't carry secrets that don't belong to her. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside, the porch light buzzed faintly against a moth, the same sound I remembered from childhood summers, and I understood that this exact conversation at this exact table was the thing Aliner had been building toward with every dinner, every loose stone, every quiet instruction in that letter. I have letters, I told Marguerite finally. Between your mother and a man named Russell Voss. I think you should see them if you're ready. She was. We sat together until almost midnight, and by the time she left, she had agreed to something I hadn't expected to need to ask for. She would testify, if it came to that, to what she'd heard as a 16-year-old girl listening through a half-closed door. I waited 5 more days before I said anything to Patricia directly, partly because Aliner's instructions had been about patience, and partly because I needed that time to have the documents properly reviewed. I'd quietly contacted a property attorney recommended by Mr. Crane, a woman named Constance Farrow who specialized in inheritance disputes, and who, after reviewing the Voss letters, the ledger, and the guardianship paperwork, told me in a tone of carefully controlled professional outrage that what Patricia had done very likely constituted fraud, and that the statute of limitations, given the circumstances of discovery, was very much still in my favor. On the 22nd night, I set an extra place at the table that wasn't for any of the 3 guests Aliner's will required. Constance Farrow sat quietly at the far end of the table while I served dinner as though nothing were different, and I watched Patricia's eyes catch on the unfamiliar woman, watched the first genuine flicker of unease cross her composed face in 22 consecutive nights of performance. "This is Constance," I said, once everyone was seated. "She's a property attorney. I asked her to join us tonight because I found something in the cellar a few weeks ago that I think we should discuss as a family, since we're all already in the habit of discussing things as a family now." Davenport's water glass paused halfway to his mouth. Patricia's hands, I noticed, exactly as Aliner had told me to watch, went very still against the tablecloth. I laid the folder on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Aliner had taught me, all those summers ago, that the quietest moment in a room is often the one that does the most damage, because people brace themselves for shouting and have no defense prepared for calm. 10 acres along the creek, I said. My father's land. Sold the spring I turned 20, while my mother was sick and signing whatever papers were put in front of her, through a guardianship arrangement that, as it turns out, was never actually legal, because I was never declared incompetent and my mother had no legal standing to sign away property that was held in trust for me directly. Constance can walk you through the specifics, but the short version is that the sale was fraudulent, the proceeds are documented, and the trail leads directly back to you, Patricia, and to a man named Russell Voss, whose letters I have in this folder. The silence that followed had a different texture than the one in the law office, weeks earlier. That silence had been shock. This one was the silence of someone watching a wall they'd built carefully, over 20 years, finally show its cracks in front of everyone who mattered. Patricia recovered fastest, as she always did. "I don't know what you think you found," she said, But I think you're confused about the nature of an old family arrangement that— I have the letters, I said, and I have Marguerite. Marguerite, who had known this moment was coming, who had asked to be there for exactly this reason, set down her fork and looked at her mother with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, not triumphant, not cruel, just finally honest. I heard you on the phone with Voss, she said. I was 16. I've known for 15 years, Mom, and I should have said something a long time ago, and I'm sorry I didn't, but I'm saying it now. Patricia's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do in 20 years of careful study. It simply, fully, came apart. Davenport tried, predictably, to distance himself. I didn't know the details. I was young. I just knew Mom had handled something with the land. Until Constance quietly produced a bank record showing the timeline of his first home's down payment, deposited 11 days after the Voss transfer cleared, the amounts aligning closely enough that even his own lawyer, when he finally hired one in the weeks that followed, advised him not to contest the connection. He left the table that night without finishing his meal. The first dinner of the 30 he failed to complete in full, though under the will's terms. A partial attendance still counted, and I found myself, even then, unwilling to be petty about technicalities Alina herself would not have wanted weaponized for spite. The point was never to win on a clause. The point was the truth finally sitting on the table where everyone could see it. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way the confrontation itself had been. They were procedural, exhausting, full of meetings with Constance. A quiet civil suit filed against Patricia for the value of the land plus interest. A separate negotiation regarding restitution that Patricia, faced with the alternative of a much messier public proceeding, ultimately agreed to settle rather than fight. She did not apologize, not really. What she offered instead was a clipped, lawyer-reviewed statement acknowledging an irregularity in estate handling, which was as close to an admission as 20 years of careful composure would ever allow her to come. I had stopped, by then, needing her apology. I had simply needed the truth to exist somewhere outside my own memory, documented, undeniable, finally real to people other than me. The remaining dinners played out quieter than the first 22. Patricia attended 3 more, sitting through them with a stiffness that never fully softened, before the 30 days concluded and the requirement, mercifully, expired. Davenport attended 2, silent, chastened in a way that felt less like genuine remorse and more like a man recalculating what damage control looked like. Marguerite came to every single one, and somewhere around the 26th night, we stopped performing reconciliation and started, tentatively, building something that resembled an actual relationship. 2 women who had both been shaped, in very different ways, by the same family's capacity for quiet cruelty. I still live at Briar Hollow. The garden is less feral than it was the year Alina died, though I've kept the climbing roses exactly where they were, because some things deserve to stay wild on purpose. I finished my 30 dinners, claimed the deed, and used part of the settlement from Patricia to finally pay off what remained of my mother's medical debt, 8 years after her death, which felt less like justice and more like closing a door that had been left open far too long. Patricia and I speak rarely now, and only when necessary. Davenport and I don't speak at all, and I've made my peace with that. But Marguerite drives out to Briar Hollow most Sundays, and we sit on the same porch where Alina used to watch me weed her garden beds, and she tells me, sometimes, about the parts of our family history I never had access to. And I tell her in return about the father she never really got to know. The boy who climbed the old oak by the pond, who invented ghost stories to get out of chores, who would have been, I think, fiercely proud of the woman his daughter finally became. I think about Alina often, especially in the cellar, which I've since cleared out properly, though I left that one loose stone exactly as it was, mortar and all, because some doors are worth remembering you once had to find. She didn't write me a clause about reconciliation dinners because she believed family wounds heal over a shared meal. She wrote it because she understood something I didn't yet know about myself, that I had spent 20 years being underestimated by people who never once imagined I was paying attention, and she wanted to give me 30 nights, a long table, and just enough patience to let them prove, in their own careless, comfortable way, exactly who they really were. She didn't leave me a house. She left me a witness stand and the quiet confidence to finally take it. I'm the girl who watched from the porch all those summers ago. I'm the girl who held on to things the way she taught me to. And now, when the foxglove blooms along that overgrown trellis every spring, I think she'd say I finally understand what she meant all those years by good.